Cemeteries. The place where we bury the stinky old bones of our stinky old ancestors. But what if something else stalked these rows at night? Well, not specifically these rows, but the rows in Highgate Cemetery in Hampstead, England, where it was rumored that in the 1970s, a vampire stalked the lanes of Highgate. Naturally, two amateur vampire hunters came up and decided to destroy the villain. But what resulted was a decades-long feud between the two that even led to them scheduling a magical duel. So join me for this tale of giant vampire spiders, drunken cemetery riots, and nudes. Odd things were happening in Highgate Cemetery in the late 1960s. Two teenage girls walking home from school said that they saw the dead rise from their graves. Another teenage girl said that she woke one night to something cold and clinging on her hand, and in the morning light saw that her hand was torn and bloodied. A little old lady walking her little old dog even saw two eyes staring out from the darkness of the graveyard. Now this all begged the question, if there's something strange in your neighborhood, who are you gonna call? The local band of weirdos, that's who. And in this case, that band of weirdos was the British Psychic and Occult Society, or BPOS for short, which I'm going to be referring to them as that for the entire video because British Psychic and Occult Society is such a long name to say on repeat, so just keep that in mind. And at the head of this band of misfits and weirdos was the first of our two vampire hunters for this story, David Farrant. President of the BPOS, Wiccan High Priest, and just hanging in their poster incarnate, David Farrant didn't really believe the tales of the vampire until an accountant under the pseudonym Thornton came to him one day and told him of his own encounter with the vampire. Farrant claims that when he first arrived at Highgate Cemetery, the place was in shambles. There were smashed open crypts, there were skeletons that were just tumbled out of their caskets willy-nilly, and there was an unusual amount of dead foxes that, according to David Farrant, had died suddenly and from unusual circumstances. In December of 1969, Farrant said that he had his own encounter with the vampire at the same spot that Thornton did. He said that it was without form but had two glowing red eyes that denoted an alive presence to him.
Decided to pay a midnight visit to the cemetery to combat the vampire once and for all. He armed himself with a cross and stake and crouched between the tombstones waiting.
Have you ever seen this vampire?
I have seen it, yes. I saw it last February, and I saw it on 2 occasions.
What was it like?
It took the form of a tall, grey figure, and it about 8 feet tall, and it seemed to glide off the path without making any noise.
But before David Farrant knew it, he was under psychic attack. But just as quickly as it started, it ended, and the phantom disappeared. This led Farrant to return to the BPOS hideout, which I assume is a treehouse, where they formed a plan to put Highgate under surveillance. This actually worked out because the BPOS spotted the creature twice and accordingly sent a non-alarmist letter to the local newspaper, the Hampstead and Highgate Express, which I'm going to be referring to the same way that locals do, as the Ham and High. The situation was even worse than David Farrant had feared, however, because they had found evidence of satanic black masses. Yeah, except no, it's bad in this situation because Satanists aren't cool goths. They're the devil's worshippers. They're the devil's assistants. What's worse is that, according to Farrant, these weren't amateur Satanists. No. These were professional Satanists. They went to a 4-year college for Satanism. They got their major in it, and they got a minor in making pentagrams. they got really into Wicca, too. That's a minor. Farrant was contacted for interviews with the Ham and High, as well as with Thames TV. But there's another person that they were interviewing that Farrant would later describe as, quote, a somewhat theatrical character who had been pestering local newspapers looking for publicity since he had first became aware of the investigation. That man was the second of our 2 vampire hunters for this story, Bishop Seán Manchester.
Satan, get ye behind me and be gone from this place forever.
Self-proclaimed vampirologist, exorcist, bishop of the Old Catholic Church, and Jack Nicholson's most daring role yet, Seán Manchester had been on his own investigation of the Highgate vampire up to this point. Upon hearing this, you probably have 2 major questions. 1, what's the Old Catholic Church? Is it different from the Roman Catholic Church? And to answer that quickly, kinda? It's a breakaway sect of Catholicism that technically exists. It has a Wikipedia page, but I don't think you would find like a local Old Catholic church in your area. But then again, I tried Googling Old Catholic churches in my area, and guess what I got? Old Roman Catholic churches, so I think their search terms are just messed up. Like the SEO is terrible for it. So I don't actually know if there's local Old Catholic churches, but there's probably not. And the second question is Seán Manchester really a bishop? And as far as I know, no. Because for Roman Catholic bishops, you have to be like a priest for 5 years, you gotta be appointed to it, it's a whole process. And Seán Manchester, I don't think he had to go through a similar process. As far as I know, he woke up one day, put on some bishop robes, and said, I am a bishop, everybody. And then everybody just kind of had to go along with it, because there's only so long that somebody can be like, I'm a bishop, I'm a bishop, I'm a bishop, before everyone's like, I guess he's like a bishop, because who would lie about that? You can't really go up to them and be like, where's your bishop badge? What's your badge number, man? There's no official registry or anything that I could look up. And to be fair, only Seán Manchester would lie about this. He's the only fake bishop I've ever heard of. So, like... Sneeze. Both men wanted to crusade against evil. They were in the midst of the satanic panic after all, but they kind of disagreed on how to go about it. For one, they couldn't even agree on what the vampire was. David Farrant thought it was a malevolent spirit or a ghost or something that he had to forcefully escort out like a drunk girl out of a pub. Seán Manchester, on the other hand, thought he was going against Dracula. He thought it was a full Bela Lugosi, Christopher Lee, hammer horror, vampire with pointy teeth, a big collar, a cape, I think, and was gonna come into people's houses at night and suckle their blood.
Dracula scrape with his fangs and lick up the blood, like this. See? Scrape and lick. Scrape and...
And accordingly, his account of the story in his book, Highgate Vampire, The Infernal World of the Undead, unearthed at London's famous Highgate Cemetery and environs. Which sounds like the goddamn diary of Van Helsing himself. So do me a favor, and take this with the biggest grain of salt that you can find.
Yeah, she was in great pain. Then we cut off her head and drove a stake to her heart and burned it, and then she found peace.
Doctor!
Remember those 2 teenage girls that I mentioned that saw the dead rise from their graves? Well, one of the girls, named Elizabeth, said that after the encounter, she had nightmares of a man with a pale, gaunt face coming into her room at night. Elizabeth's health began to fade as her urge to return to Highgate only increased, which was all revealed to Manchester over a lunch date. Elizabeth's boyfriend Keith even corroborated her account and said that she had 2 little bite marks on her neck. For some reason, Manchester just kind of goes, well, I'll check that out later, bye-bye, and just like leaves for no reason. And it isn't until 2 weeks later that he comes back that he sees the now inflamed bite marks on her neck and goes, ooh, this is kind of serious, isn't it? It was revealed that recently, Elizabeth had moved out of her parents' home, a home filled with crucifixes. So naturally, the solution was just to kind of throw a few crucifixes around, sprinkle some holy water, and then boom, Elizabeth is done with her vampire problem. After the Ham and High articles came out, people came out of the woodwork with their own tales of the vampire. One of these people was a woman named Lucia, who had a very similar story to Elizabeth's. When he arrived at her house, though, Manchester said that he saw her vacantly staring out of a window, while the remnants of the Strauss composition Metamorphosin faded out in the background. Now, the sources I have don't state whether she had, like, a record player or anything playing at the same time, but I would not put it past Seán Manchester just to have, like, a soundtrack going on in his head at all times where he's just like, On this occasion, though, he made sure to check if she had bite marks on her neck, but confusingly, again, he just kind of looked at him and went, huh, weird. All right, I'll be back. Just, like, left again. One night, Lucia left her sickbed and glided her way to Highgate Cemetery, only wearing a nightrobe. Manchester followed, and he said that Lucia made her way to the largest crypt in the graveyard. A reverberation went through the entire cemetery as Manchester felt his vision graying out. Sensing that the vampire was near, he threw a silver stake in the general direction that he thought the vampire was. But this was enough to break Lucia out of her trance, and he was able to lead her home. But because the vampire wanted his damsel DoorDash straight to his door, this led Manchester to the lair of the vampire! Returning back to the interviews that we kind of diverged from, both vampire hunters had their own pitch of why they'd be the best candidate to defeat the vampire. When asked if the creature he was hunting was flesh and blood, David Farrant responded that if it was, he would make sure that it rests in peace. Wink. Seán Manchester, on the other hand, had a much more provocative pitch. He said that the vampire that they're hunting wasn't an ordinary vampire, no. It was a king vampire. He also told the reporters, quote, "We would like to exorcise the vampire by the traditional and approved manner. Drive a stake through its heart with one blow just after dawn between Friday and Saturday. Chop the head off with a gravedigger's shovel and burn what remains. This is what the clergy did centuries ago, but we would be breaking the law today, so my hands are tied."
The only certain way of destroying an undead is by driving a wooden stake, like the one I have here, straight through the heart with one blow.
Well, I think they're nutcases, actually.
He then set a date of March 13th, 1970 for a public vampire hunt. If it wasn't already apparent, I find the vampire hunters in this case to be the most interesting aspect of it, because both of these men fit into two roles that I've noticed in a lot of paranormal investigations, that of the scientist and the showman. The scientist, represented by David Farrant in this case, wants to do everything properly in order to break through the stigma around paranormal investigations and get validation from the rest of society. The showman, on the other hand, has an attractive confidence because, "Brother, I'm gonna kill that vampire, I'm gonna go on the ropes and I'm gonna give him the people's elbow." The showman knows that all you really need is a good story, and so what if you kind of stretch the truth a little bit, or a lot. If you've ever seen one of the many ghost shows that are on, you've seen this in full swing, because there are shows where their big piece of evidence is like a toothbrush like falling off a sink and they're like, oh my god, versus the other shows that it's like they're walking into a haunted house basically, where interns are like throwing rocks and like slamming doors and stuff.
It kind of reminds me of like a mental. No, you're too early. When I say mental asylum, when I say mental asylum, do it. And it kind of reminds me of like an old mental asylum. It really, really does. Look at this place.
And unfortunately for David Farrant, proper and reasonable wasn't what the people wanted. And Seán Manchester's battle cry of "Let's kill a vampire" was enough to send the entire city into a frenzy. So much so that the night of, hundreds of drunken revelers showed up with homemade crosses and stakes, ready to bag themselves a vampire. David Farrant was aghast at the destructive crowds, but Seán Manchester was in his element. And soon he was picking a group of trusted assistants to help him storm the crypt. Could you imagine not being picked for that dodgeball team? Seán Manchester's just like, you're cool, you suck, no, I hate you. You're pretty cool. Like, oh man, I didn't get to go on the vampire hunt team. They found that the gate was locked, and so they had to go through the ceiling, Mission Impossible style. They found 3 coffins, but no vampire. So Seán Manchester fouled the lair of the beast by putting in holy water and garlic into all the caskets before returning to the surface, which is about when the cops showed up, which of course the police were going to arrive when there's like hundreds of drunken people being like, where's the vampire? I'm gonna get him myself. Get him. Manchester was able to avoid prosecution in this case, probably due to the fact that he was dressed as a bishop in a cemetery, but David Farrant wouldn't be so lucky on his next outing to Highgate. Presumably to keep a low profile, both vampire hunters paused their investigations until 2 girls stumbled upon a Victorian-era corpse on Highgate that had been burned, beheaded, and staked through the heart, which is exactly how Seán Manchester said you'd kill a vampire. The next part of the story is one that I have labeled, David Farrant Gets Arrested a Lot. On the night of August 17th, 1970, David Farrant and the BPOS went to the Thornton site to set up a magical ritual. They set up a magical circle using water and salt, and they set up a smaller circle about 10 feet away that they thought that the vampire would show up in when they're done with the ritual. Probably to ask him like, hey, what are you doing here? Why? But not even 15 minutes into their ritual did the police show up and ruin everybody's fun. Normally, it's very dangerous to try to break out of a magical circle in the middle of a ritual, but you know what's more dangerous? Going to jail. So the BPOS and David Farrant all took all their things and scattered to the wind. Unfortunately for David Farrant, he took one wrong turn and he ended up getting trapped by the police, who had seen him just like flinging paraphernalia as he went. But David Farrant is no rat, and so everybody just kind of acquitted him for the crime because he didn't really do anything, and it's not really a crime to be a weirdo. Meanwhile, Manchester decided to check in on that whole vampire business again, and so he broke back into the vampire's lair, but he found that one of the coffins was missing. Manchester knew he would need a bloodhound to find the vampire's lair again, and since she had been so obliging the first time, he decided that Lucia would be the perfect bait. He was able to convince her to go back to the cemetery, but once they got inside, she started saying spooky stuff, such as, "Where are you?" and "You should never have come here," before collapsing in front of the same crypt that the burned Victorian body was found, indicating to Manchester that this was the backup lair of the vampire. Manchester and his team broke into this new crypt, and soon they found that it had one too many coffins. Upon opening its lid, they came face to face with a real, parchment white skin, sharp tooth, with still blood clots at the corner of his mouth like he just had a snack and he's a messy eater, real vampire that Seán Manchester was about to drive his stake through the heart of the beast, before being reminded by one of his crew members that it's actually illegal to stab a corpse even if you think it's a vampire, so maybe we shouldn't.
Stake through someone is murder. And this seems to me rather basic.
Oh no, she's undead, so they murdered them.
Well, presumably a vampire has been issued with a death certificate.
Yeah, but listen, you're killing them because, let's face it, they come back and drink blood. But don't you need to have evidence? I mean, you can't hang murderers because
if you went into my granny's tomb,
you actually need witnesses, you need a trial, you need a judge, you need a verdict.
If you went to my granny's tomb and put a stake through her heart,
the vampire's greatest strength is the fact that nobody believes in it.
That's a quote from Bram Stoker.
And stunningly, Seán Manchester actually listened to him, and so they just kind of put the lid back on, sprinkled some holy water and garlic around, and then bricked up the crypt and went, all right, done. The cask of Amontillado, this vampire, they're like, yeah, that'll work. Given that, so the laws of God once again shrunk before the laws of man. But this does beg the question, what if your belief in the supernatural got you into some legal hot water? Would you still be liable? I actually answered this question in my video about the Hammersmith ghost case, so check that out if you have a little bit of time, but let's check back in with David Farrant. Farrant, that wet ferret of a man, was not having a good time. He was fined for indecent behavior after a nightly ritual at the graveyard at St. Mary the Virgins. Things got even worse for Farrant when pictures of him posing next to open caskets were revealed, which landed him the official charges of damaging a burial memorial and interfering with corpses. Oh, and those pictures, they also featured topless chicks, which, I'm not gonna lie, that kind of rules. Like, topless chicks hanging out next to open caskets, that's like a heavy metal album cover. Like, I understand that it's a crime, but it's cool. David Farrant isn't a rat.
Hey, I'm a rat! I ain't no snitch!
And so he didn't tell them who his accomplices are, but this landed him a sentence of 5 years in prison, of which he served 3. He also got served divorce papers by his wife on account of the whole hanging out with corpses and topless chicks that weren't her thing. This was not the end of the story for Seán Manchester, however. There was still a king vampire to defeat. And he was in luck when he found the backup lair of the vampire in an old mansion that was near to Highgate. And inside he found the same casket as before. This time, Seán Manchester didn't hesitate to throw the lid off and stab the vampire straight into its foul heart.
Oh my God!
And according to Manchester, he said that the vampire let out a deafening shriek before starting to collapse in on itself, spilling disgusting brown viscera into the bottom of the casket, like a poorly made cake on the Great British Bake Off.
Obviously, it does look, it does look,
disgusting?
Yeah.
But even though the king vampire was now defeated, there were still a few loose ends to tie up. Remember Lucia? Well, it turns out that she had been turned into a vampire herself. And by that I mean she had died and been buried already, but what's a little bit of body tampering and grave digging among friends, am I right? And so, Seán Manchester dug up her grave, and from within a protective magical circle, he started an exorcism on her body. And this next part is straight from Seán Manchester's mouth. He 100% stands by this. He says that Lucia's body emerged and transformed into a giant cat-sized spider that started to attack him in his protective circle in vain. Manchester then took his trusty stake out and stabbed the spider straight in the abdomen, causing it to shriek out in pain and anguish before transforming back into the deceased body of Lucia. Still dead, mind you, but this time she wasn't a spooky vampire spider, so that's better. I'm gonna say for everybody, that's an improvement. And Seán Manchester stands by this 100%, because anytime anyone calls him on it in like interviews and stuff, he's like, why yes, of course, I stabbed the spider, it died and transformed back into the corpse. What's so wild about that? Like, it's amazing.
One of the vampires, or the creatures you came up against, Seán, turned into a spider in front of you.
That was one of its demonic manifestations. Of course, metamorphosis is one of the peculiarities of the true undead.
Must have been a bit frightening.
Oh yes, terrifying.
And what happened? Did it all of a sudden just whoosh, become a spider, or?
No, I only recognized it when it was already in that condition, but it was not an arachnid of the normal size. It was more the size of a large cat.
A spider the size of a large cat? That must have been...
At least that's how it seemed. You must remember that this was in the dead of night, and a very dull light afforded any illumination. But it was undoubtedly a gigantic spider. And upon exorcism, there was no doubt as to the fact that it was demonic.
Right, some callers on the line.
You would think that the rivalry between these two would probably end once the king vampire was killed, right? Well, you'd be wrong on that, because these guys went so far as to schedule a magical duel with one another that they were actually going to go through with. David Farrant said yes to it as long as only the combatants and their seconds could watch. I think probably because they were planning on doing like spells and swords during it on Parliament Hill, and I don't think they wanted other people to see them go like, fireball, fireball. Begone, demon, you terrible, you skinny man, get a job. Fireball. Fireball. Like, but sadly for the world, the police figured out that they're going to have this magical fight because they found flyers advertising the event. And so they're like, hey, don't do that. Stop that. And so they never went through with it. After publishing his own book on the case with a similarly long-winded title of Beyond the Highgate Vampire, a true case of supernatural occurrences and vampirism that centered around London's Highgate Cemetery, David Farrant seemed to have a good humor about the whole thing, and even created a webcomic to poke fun at his old rival called The Adventures of Bishop Bonkers, depicting an evil bishop, who obviously represents Manchester, being foiled by David Farrant's self-insert character with his guile and charm. It's super nostalgic, it's super fun. Manchester, in his own serious, humorless way, fired back by painting pictures of David Farrant as a demon, which I feel like that adds to the romanticism that Seán Manchester has for his own life, where he's just like, and I shall draw my biggest villain. You. This is what you get for making fun of me. I'm not Bishop Bonkers. You're the idiot.
Is it tall or?
Yes.
How tall?
Unusually tall. And unusually large.
Could you stand up, please? Because is this the way? Have you seen this man before?
Tall, but not that tall.
Unfortunately for the vampire hunters and the rest of the world, they couldn't make good on their promise to have a magical duel, because in 2019, David Farrant sadly passed away at the age of 73, leaving behind his third wife and his 2 children. Seán Manchester seems to have grown soft in his old age and left an obituary for his old rival, stating at the end of it, "Though he may not want my prayers, he has them anyway. Rest in peace." That's where we are today. Seán Manchester still has his own Facebook page and YouTube channel, which he doesn't seem to have gotten the concept of like screen capture down, because all of his videos are just like him filming a CRT TV, which is amazing.
Merry Christmas.
So check out his YouTube channel if you'd like, but also he seems to really dig his own publicity, so he might land on this page, and if he does, hi Seán, how are you? Thanks for doing this and making a great story for us. This story just like captures me. I think it's so interesting seeing these two guys who are objectively kind of insane duke it out over something that is equally insane, such as being a vampire hunter. And also check out some of my old content, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. But that also leaves us with, check out my podcast, Segment City, where I host it with my friend Theo, where you can see content just like this.
Get ready for this one. Hot Pockets introduces its first ever holiday sweater with zip-off sleeves to celebrate the brand removing its sleeves from snack packaging.
I mean, there's so much
This is an all-timer, baby.
All-timer. This is... What's the point? All right, bye.